He didn't leave a fingerprint. He didn't leave a hair. He left a breath, warm, sour, silent, pressed into the fabric of her pillow like a ghost that refused to vanish. And the moment I inhaled it, I knew exactly who it belonged to. I'm George Michaelson, and I've spent 32 years following invisible trails that most people don't even know exist. I still remember the night in Syracuse when I walked into that dim motel room, snow swirling outside the window, and saw a pillow that whispered secrets no fingerprint ever could. I hadn't intended to become the world's first nose cop, but that winter of 1996 changed everything. I'd been called in as an independent consultant, my specialty, olfactory forensics. And from the moment I lifted that pillowcase, I knew this wasn't a simple death in sleep. You know that feeling when a scent carries you across memories? It was like deja vu and dread wrapped in one. Man, I'll never forget that day. By 20 seconds into this story, if you're as curious about the power of smell in criminal investigations as I am, do me a favor and tap that like button, maybe drop a comment and subscribe, because you don't want to miss what comes next. Back in '96, DNA profiling wasn't on everyone's mind, and nobody thought to trace the lingering odor of breath on fabric, but I did. I saw how Sarah Wells's last breath mingled with something acidic, damp, a hint of whiskey and tobacco, and I knew this was no accident. I raised my eyebrows, but I don't shout, because in my world, the quietest clue can shout the loudest truth. This smell wasn't hers, not her lavender shampoo or her vegan detergent. It was a man's breath left behind, hours of inhaling and exhaling in that same spot. That's when my intuition clicked. The killer had literally left a piece of himself on that pillow for me to catch. And so began a case that would earn the nickname the first nasal arrest. A case without DNA, without a single fingerprint, but with the undeniable power of human scent. Stay with me, because what happened next will challenge everything you thought you knew about forensic science. I grew up in a small upstate New York town where the winters lasted half the year and every house smelled like wood smoke and pine. My father was a mechanic, my mother a seamstress, and I was the kid who could walk into the house after school and tell exactly which tool he'd used last or which fabric she'd been cutting. You know that feeling when a scent becomes a signature, a map of someone's day? To be honest, I never thought much of it until I joined the Syracuse Police Department as a patrol officer in the early '80s. It was supposed to be a way to serve my community and make steady pay. But in those first few months on the beat, I kept noticing subtle clues that everyone else missed. The faint whiff of antifreeze in a garage break-in, the acidic tang of spilled bleach in an abandoned motel room. Man, it was crazy how every odor told a story. By the time I transferred to the crime lab division, I realized my nose was more than just a sensory organ. It was a tool as precise as a fingerprint kit. That's when I decided to specialize in olfactory forensics, a field few even knew existed, let alone respected. Over 32 years later, I'm still refining what I call scent profiling, but those early days shaped my approach. I spent hours learning chromatography techniques, memorizing the molecular breakdown of everyday substances, everything from petroleum residues to cooking oils. I watched chemists pore over spectrographs while I focused on scent trails, correlating volatile organic compounds with real-world sources. In the beginning, senior investigators thought I was eccentric, even a bit of a novelty act. "George smells the crime scene," they'd joke. I let them joke. I raised my eyebrows, but I never defended my method with loud speeches. Instead, I quietly amassed case files where odor evidence led to arrests long before DNA or digital footprints would have registered. After 20 years in the department, I stepped away to consult independently for the FBI and private firms. To them, I'm not just a retired cop, I'm a living database of human scent, a walking library of breakdown products that linger in fabric, hair, carpet, and skin. I carry references in my head. Which brands of tobacco leave a smoky amber note? Which industrial solvents give off a metallic sourness? Which cleaning agents mask human presence? Working on high-profile cases taught me one fundamental truth. Science can measure molecules, but sometimes the human element, the subtle interaction between a person and their environment, speaks louder than any instrument. Life as a consultant is different from police routine. I keep a workshop above my garage, walls lined with fabric samples in airtight containers, dozens of miniature amber vials labeled with chemical formulas and source names. My desk is cluttered with old case photographs, technical journals, and a single-frame newspaper clipping. First nasal arrest in county history. Every morning before dawn, I review whatever sample I need to think through. A swatch of upholstery from a crime scene, or a fresh pillowcase from an evidence locker. By midday, I'm meeting prosecutors or field agents, guiding them through the logic of scent transfer and advising on how to document it in a way that holds up in court. People ask if it's lonely work. To be honest, I don't feel lonely. I feel focused. My lab bench is my companion, and every subtle aroma is another clue waiting to be decoded. When I speak about a new case, I don't shout or gesture wildly. I speak slowly, deliberately, because in my world, patience is the secret weapon. Every pause, every carefully chosen word, allows the listener to catch a whiff of the bigger picture. That's who I am, George Michaelson, the man who listens with his nose, carries odor profiles like a ledger, and never underestimates the power of a single breath. It was late January of 1996, and Syracuse was in the grip of a bitter cold snap. Snowdrifts piled against storefronts, and the wind cut through your coat like a knife. I remember driving down East Taft Road toward that worn-out motel above the laundromat, headlights reflecting off ice-glazed pavement. I'd been called in after the patrol officers found the body of Sarah Wells in room 12, and when I arrived, the door was propped open, yellow police tape fluttering in the draft. Deputy Marsh was there, rubbing his hands together, breath fogging in the hallway. He looked at me and just nodded. No sign of forced entry, no signs of struggle, just Sarah lying on the bed in what looked like a peaceful sleep. You could almost forget you were at a crime scene, except for the chill in the air and the odd quiet that made even the dripping radiator sound loud. To my left stood Agent Rogers from the State Bureau, chewing on his bottom lip, glancing at the pillow. On the nightstand, a framed photo of Sarah smiling in a sunlit park caught my eye. Her eyes bright, hair blowing in the breeze. It felt like a cruel joke that someone who radiated warmth and life could be found so cold in death. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on scattered grains of detergent that had spilled from a bag on the floor, a clue I would come back to later. Across the narrow room, a single overhead bulb cast long shadows, and the hotel's peeling wallpaper reminded me of old cases where the smallest crack had led to the biggest breakthrough. I took in the ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the heater, and then I bent over the pillow. It sat on top of a rumpled blanket, untouched, as if waiting for someone to lift it. Next to me, Agent Rogers whispered, "No fingerprints, George. No DNA." He tapped the side of his nose, clearly unsettled. I just nodded and ran a gloved hand along the seam, feeling the weight of the moment. Outside, I could hear Officer Alvarez chatting quietly with the motel manager, an anxious woman clutching her pepper spray holster. She kept glancing toward the room, wringing her hands, eyes wide with that mix of curiosity and dread. Inside, I was steadier, except for that split second when I inhaled the first trace of something unexpected. A damp, metallic tang, like stale whiskey and half-smoked cigarettes, woven into the soft cotton of the pillowcase. Man, it was crazy how a smell could hit you like a memory you never knew you had. I closed my eyes for a moment and let my instincts speak. "You smell that?" I asked, my voice low but firm. Rogers leaned in, raising an eyebrow. "Not her shampoo," I continued, "not her detergent. Something else." He frowned, scanning the room, but all I heard was the dripping pipe behind us. I ran my finger along the edge of the pillowcase, lifting a tiny crease near the zipper. In that crease, I caught another hint, a sour, acidic note that spoke of human breath lingering too long. It was the trigger, the moment when I knew this pillow was more than bedding, it was evidence. That's when I called for a sealed bag, a sterile swab, and told everyone to back off. The room felt charged, like the instant before thunder cracks across a dark sky. Every person in that room, Marsh, Rogers, Alvarez, looked at me, waiting for me to explain what I'd found. I simply inhaled again and said, "This pillow's alive." And just like that, the story began. By the time I'd secured that pillow in an evidence bag, the first crack started to show. It began with a slip in the chain of custody. Officer Alvarez, scrambling to document the scene, forgot to log the swab number before sealing the sample. Man, it was crazy. One tiny oversight, and suddenly the whole case felt like it was teetering on quicksand. Next, the local lab called to say they were overwhelmed with homicide evidence from recent break-ins. They couldn't get to our pillow sample for another 3 days. 3 days in January in Syracuse feels like an eternity when you're racing against decomposition and contamination. I pressed them to prioritize volatile organic compounds analysis, explaining that the acidic tinge in the breath scent was our only lead, but the supervisor insisted we wait our turn. Meanwhile, word got out to the patrol division that the nose guy was chasing ghosts again. Deputy Marsh cornered me in the hallway, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, and muttered, "George, we need hard evidence. DNA, fingerprints, before we waste more resources on, well, a weird hunch." His tone carried that unspoken question. Am I chasing phantom smells? I could feel the tension gathering like storm clouds. To keep the investigation on track, I needed concurrence from Agent Rogers. But Rogers had just received word from the DA's office. Without fingerprint or DNA confirmation, they'd likely throw the case out before trial. My specialty was respected in private consultations, but in a courtroom, scent evidence was still fringe science. Then there was the human factor. Trevor B., the ex-boyfriend we suspected, clung to his flimsy alibi. He claimed he'd been at the bowling alley with co-workers, but the manager's statement was inconsistent, and the security footage had a 5-minute gap right when Sarah would have been alone. He sat across from me in the interview room, eyes darting under the fluorescent lights, sweating through that same gray t-shirt. I knew that shirt held my answer, but I couldn't confront him without lab results. Otherwise, any defense attorney could tear me apart on cross-examination. "Mr. Michaelson, how many times have you sniffed clothing in your career? Can you prove it wasn't your imagination?" I still get goosebumps thinking about standing at the witness stand, grilled by a prosecutor who saw olfactory forensics as nothing more than a circus trick. On top of that, the lab's delay meant the fabric sample from Trevor's shirt sat in the county locker, unprotected from temperature swings. A thaw-refreeze cycle could mask or even mimic the whiskey and tobacco signature I needed. Every morning I'd walk into my workshop, stare at the rows of sealed containers, and wonder if waiting would cost me that one break in the case. To complicate matters further, Sarah's family, grieving and desperate, demanded swift justice. The victim advocate kept calling, asking for updates, and I could hear the hope in her voice. "Tell them I'm working," I'd say, but internally I was battling frustration. I knew what the evidence meant, but the system wasn't built for smells. Late one night, I received a call. The lab had finally cleared space to run a gas chromatograph on the pillow swab, but their preliminary report flagged an unexpected compound: mothball residue. They speculated someone had aired out the motel room with camphor crystals, poisoning the sample. My stomach dropped. Camphor has its own volatile profile that can overshadow the subtler notes of ethanol and nicotine. If that mothball scent dominated, my entire scent profile would be invalidated. I debated rushing back to the motel, reclaiming the room for a retest, but the management had already cleaned, and the linens were gone. In that moment, I faced a dilemma. Do I double down, push for retesting under tighter protocols and risk alienating everyone involved? Or do I shelve the olfactory lead and hope a fingerprint or a stray hair jumps out of nowhere? My training told me to trust the science, but my instincts screamed that if I abandoned the scent trail now, I'd never get another chance. So I stayed up all night drafting a protocol addendum, a new swab, sterile packaging, chain of custody revisions, and a request for an accelerated GCMS run at the state chem lab. It was a long shot, but in that haze of stress and cold, I realized that sometimes the hardest part of a forensic investigation isn't finding the clue. It's convincing the world to believe in the power of one small breath. I'll never forget the moment the lab called me at 2 in the morning. My phone buzzed beside a half-empty coffee cup in my workshop, the amber glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows over fabric samples. "George, the results are in," the technician said, and for a heartbeat I held my breath. Literally, in that silent room where every exhale felt heavy. When she walked me through the chromatograph peaks, ethanol metabolites, nicotine byproducts, and the unique fatty acid profile matching the ion signature on Trevor's shirt, I felt a surge of vindication and relief so powerful it almost knocked me off my chair. Man, it was crazy how a graph on a screen could validate everything I'd smelled with my own nose. I could almost hear Sarah's whispered justice on the wind outside. I arrived at the precinct before dawn, snow still drifting in great white flakes, and found Trevor in the interrogation room under harsh fluorescence, eyes bloodshot from a long night. He looked up as I walked in, that same gray t-shirt wearing him like a guilty halo. I placed the lab printouts on the table, 3 distinct GCMS spectra aligned like fingerprints, and watched the color drain from his face. "These peaks," I said quietly, pointing to the overlapping lines. "That's your odor profile. It's on the pillow, it's on your shirt, and it's the reason we know you were there." For a moment he stared, mouth parted, as if he was inhaling the gravity of his mistake. Then his shoulders slumped, and he whispered, In that instant, the tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. Agent Rogers burst in, cuffs in hand, but for a second I felt a strange hesitation. This was more than a procedural victory. It was a reckoning. Trevor's eyes met mine, and I saw shame, disbelief, and a flicker of something I couldn't name. I held his gaze without a word. In olfactory forensics, you learn that scent isn't just molecules in the air. It's memory, intent, even guilt. That look on his face confirmed everything that the science had told me. As they let him out, I gathered the lab reports and the pillow swab, my hands steady, but my heart still racing. Outside the room, I paused and gazed into the hallway, where the early morning light mixed with fluorescent glare, casting long, dramatic shadows. I remembered Sarah's photo on that nightstand, the bright park smiling back at me, and felt a swell of quiet pride. Not in myself, but in the case, in the idea that no crime, no matter how silent, could hide from the truth etched into the air. Walking back to my car, I replayed the scene over and over. The technician's tentative tone, Trevor's stunned confession, the subtle shift when science and intuition converged. Stress and doubt had gnawed at me these past days, but in that moment, the anxiety transformed into clarity. I still get goosebumps thinking about how the tiniest wrinkle in a pillowcase carried a narrative no typical evidence could tell. It was the apex of my career, the scene that would define the first nasal arrest. And I knew that no matter what came next, testimony, trial, headlines, I had stood at the edge of possibility and taken a leap of faith in my own senses. That's the climax of the story. The moment when the invisible became undeniable, when a breath caught in fabric spoke louder than any scream, and when justice, slow as winter in Syracuse, finally arrived on the wings of a single, lingering aroma. After weeks of waiting, the court date finally arrived, and Trevor B. sat at the defense table in his same gray t-shirt, eyes hollow, his attorney shuffling papers rather than meeting my gaze. I took the stand behind the witness rail, my lab reports and chromatograph printouts organized in neat stacks. The judge peered over the rim of his glasses as I explained, step by step, how olfactory forensics works, how volatile organic compounds cling to fabrics, how a trained nose and a sensitive instrument can trace ethanol metabolites and nicotine residues back to a single individual. You could feel the courtroom lean in, the hush broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. The prosecutor asked the critical question, "Mr. Michaelson, can you say with certainty that Mr. B was in that room the night Sarah Wells died?" I paused, let the silence stretch, then looked directly at Trevor and said, "I can say his breath was there. That pillow held his signature." In that moment, I still get goosebumps thinking about how powerful those words sounded. The defense attorney tried to undermine me, suggesting contamination or bias. He asked if I could have mistaken another scent for Trevor's, or if time and temperature could have altered the sample. To be honest, I didn't raise my voice. I let my eyebrows do the talking. I walked them through the chain of custody notes, the sterile packaging, the duplicate controls, and the repeatable GCMS runs. When I described the unique fatty acid profile that matched the oil left behind by Trevor's skin on his shirt, even the jury's skepticism began to waver. By mid-afternoon, after the last cross-examination, I stepped down, leaving the courtroom charged with the quiet power of that one steadfast breath. A week later, the verdict came in, guilty on first-degree murder. I was back in my workshop when I got the call, not from the DA or a colleague, but from Sarah's sister. She thanked me, her voice cracking as she said, "You gave us the truth." I still remember staring at the ceiling for a long moment, thinking how strange it is that a man who spends his life following invisible clues can bring such tangible relief to a grieving family. The judge sentenced Trevor to 25 years in state prison, and as they led him away, he looked at me one last time, something between regret and bewilderment in his eyes. I didn't say anything. I simply watched, knowing that this case would change forensic science in our county forever. For me, the aftermath wasn't filled with accolades or speeches. There was no grand ceremony, no ticker tape parade. Instead, I returned to my routine, cataloging new fabric samples, refining my chromatograph methods, consulting on other cold cases. But something had shifted. Agents started asking for scent analysis earlier in investigations, and the state crime lab even opened a small olfactory division. I'd been called eccentric once, but now innovator felt more appropriate. Even my old partner, Deputy Marsh, sent me a letter. "You changed how we see evidence." Thank you, that meant more to me than any headline. Looking back, the resolution of the Sarah Wells case taught me that justice isn't always served by fingerprints or DNA. Sometimes it's the breath left behind, the echo of a life breathed, a secret surrendered in the stillness of night. Sarah's family found closure, Trevor faced the consequences, and I found renewed purpose in my work. I carry the lessons of that case into every new investigation, reminding myself that science and intuition, working together, can turn a single moment, a solitary breath, into undeniable truth. And that, to me, is the real measure of justice. In the weeks after the trial, I found myself waking before dawn, not out of duty, but out of habit. The silence of my workshop, both comforting and haunting. I'd sit at my bench, one hand cradling a steaming mug of black coffee, the other tracing the rim of an empty glass vial, and remember the cold light in Trevor's eyes when he realized he'd been caught by something as intangible as a breath. To be honest, it shook me more than I ever expected. I've spent my career chasing odors, translating molecules into evidence, but that case reminded me how closely scent is tied to memory, guilt, even redemption. Some nights I'd dream of Sarah's pillow floating in a dark lake, the ripples carrying faint echoes of that whiskey and tobacco note, and I'd wake with a tightening in my chest. It made me question the boundary between professional detachment and personal connection. I'd always told myself I was merely an instrument, a living, breathing GCMS machine, but the truth was I felt responsible for translating that breath into justice. Her family's grief, the relief in her sister's voice, the tentative steps the crime lab took toward recognizing olfactory evidence. All of it became part of my own narrative. Slowly, I recognized a change in how I approach new cases. I was more patient, not just with the science, but with the people involved, victims' relatives, skeptical prosecutors, and even reluctant patrol officers. I realized that every sample, every swab, carried a story and emotions I couldn't ignore. My methods remained exacting, my demeanor reserved. But beneath that calm exterior, I carried a deeper empathy. I understood that the power of scent wasn't only in its scientific precision, it was in its ability to connect us to moments we thought were lost forever. Professionally, the Sarah Wells case opened doors I didn't know existed. I traveled more, sharing my findings in conferences, advising on policy for evidence handling, mentoring young forensic scientists intrigued by the promise of olfactory analysis. Personally, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I knew justice had been served in a way no one else could have achieved. Heavier because I'd seen firsthand how fragile truth can be when it's hidden in something as ephemeral as a breath. Even now, years later, I still pause whenever I enter a motel room or sift through linens, taking a moment to listen with my nose. And every time I do, I remember that one winter night in Syracuse, when a pillow whispered a story that changed my life, and perhaps in its own small way, changed how we find justice. What I learned that winter in Syracuse is that the smallest, most overlooked details can hold the greatest truths. It's easy in forensics to chase the shiniest evidence, DNA strands, bullet casing, surveillance tapes. But sometimes justice hides in the quietest corner, in a scent that lingers long after a person has gone. I came to understand that intuition isn't some mystical gift. It's the product of years spent sharpening your senses, mastering your tools, and trusting what your training has taught you. No case will ever be perfect, and there will always be skeptics questioning methods they don't fully grasp. But if you believe in your work, if you respect the science and honor the human stories behind every sample, you can bridge that gap between doubt and conviction. I learned the value of patience, how waiting for the right moment to present evidence can be as important as gathering it in the first place. I learned that empathy doesn't weaken objectivity. It strengthens your resolve to see a case through, not just for the sake of procedure, but for the people whose lives depend on truth. And most of all, I learned that sometimes the key to unlocking a mystery isn't a breakthrough from high-tech labs, but the quiet confidence to follow a hunch, no matter how strange it may seem. In the end, justice isn't served by assumptions, but by listening, truly listening to every clue, no matter how faint, and having the courage to act on what you hear. After the Sarah Wells case wrapped up, word of the first nasal arrest spread through the forensic community like wildfire. I began receiving letters and phone calls from crime labs across the country, asking for guidance on scent-based evidence handling. At conferences, I'd give presentations to packed rooms, watching young scientists lean forward, eyes bright, as I described chain of custody protocols for odor swabs and the delicate art of sample preservation. Some called me a pioneer, others offered healthy skepticism, challenging me to prove that scent analysis belonged in the courtroom. I welcomed every question, each one pushed me to refine my methods, to build a more rigorous framework so that olfactory forensics could stand shoulder to shoulder with DNA profiling and ballistic reports. Back at my workshop, the atmosphere changed too. New cases arrived with evidence bags labeled "For Michaelson, Olfactory Review," and field agents began including a scent collection step during initial scene processing. I saw a younger generation of investigators more willing to experiment, less bound by traditional evidence paradigms. In one memorable case, an art heist at a local gallery, a fellow consultant emailed me excitedly to say they'd matched the lingering smell of turpentine on a window ledge to a suspect's studio. It was a small victory, but it underscored how far the discipline had come since that snowy January night. On a personal level, the success of the Wells case reshaped my approach to every investigation. I no longer viewed scent work as a niche specialty, but as an integral component of comprehensive forensic analysis. I started mentoring junior scientists, teaching them not only the technical skills, but also how to listen, to really listen to their gut instincts and to document the intangible alongside the tangible. My style remained reserved, my tone measured, but inside I felt more energized, driven by the knowledge that even the faintest aroma could carry the weight of a person's story. Over time, the legend of my nose became less about me and more about what it represented. The idea that justice often requires unconventional thinking. I watch forensic textbooks incorporate new chapters on volatile organic compound analysis. I saw labs invest in better chromatographs and invest in training for scent handling. And though I never sought fame, I took quiet pride in knowing that a single breath, once dismissed, had opened a door for countless cases to come. In the end, the Wells case was the spark that transformed a solitary consultant's dream into a movement, one where the science of scent would forever hold its place in the pursuit of truth. Now that you've walked with me through the dim corridors of that Syracuse motel, seen how a single breath on a pillow can carry the weight of guilt and memory, I want you to pause and consider the unseen evidence all around us. I'm George Michaelson, and in my 32 years of chasing invisible trails, I've learned that the most powerful clues are often the ones we ignore. The whisper of a scent, the faint stain in a corner, the pause in someone's voice. We live in a world dazzled by cameras, fingerprints, and DNA databanks, yet justice sometimes hides in subtler places. As you go about your day, listen with more than your ears, look with more than your eyes, and remember that the stories people leave behind aren't always written in ink or imprinted on glass. In the quiet moments, in the twist of a bedsheet, the hint of tobacco on a sleeve, the lingering tang of coffee on someone's breath, there may be secrets waiting to be revealed. If a simple breath brought down a killer, what hidden truths might be unfolding around you right now, unnoticed? I challenge you to trust your instincts a little more, to pay attention to the small details that could change everything. And here's my question for you, something that might feel a little uneasy but could spark a new way of seeing the world. What if your own nose knows things about you that even you haven't admitted yet? Let me know in the comments what unexpected clue in your life you'd love to have uncovered. And remember, sometimes the quietest voices tell the most important stories.